It is my pleasure and honor to present today Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, who kindly accepted our invitation to come and talk to you, but also to students earlier today. And this wouldn't have been possible without the generous support of the Dickey Center and the Jewish Studies program, in addition to Middle East Studies program, which this is one of its kind of initial, events, right, inauguration. So I would like to thank Professor Tari El-Aris from Middle East Studies, also Ambassador Dan Benjamin, who is traveling, and this is why he's not with us this evening, and Professor Susanna Heschel, who's also in Munich for a research study and cannot be with us this evening. They both extend their warm welcome here. Ambassador Kurtzer, who is now a professor has a long title, so I have it here, is S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at the Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Ambassador Kurtzer has 29 years experience, diplomatic experience with the Arab-Israeli conflict. He was ambassador to Egypt 1997 to 2001, and he was then ambassador to Israel 2001 to 2005. Both are critical years for both countries and for the region. He was Assistant Secretary of State for Near East and Middle East. Can't exactly remember the exact title, but this is the person in the State Department who's in charge of Middle East policy. He contributed to the Iraq study group and many other assignments related to the Middle East. I have personally watched Ambassador Kurtzer operate both in Egypt and in Israel, and I've been a strong admirer of his work throughout the years. His posts were very challenging, especially both actually for different reasons, and it is amazing how he managed those challenges well. What I admired probably most about Ambassador Kurtzer was his commitment, actual commitment to promoting peace between Israelis and Palestinians. He remains one of the few informed, both scholars and practitioners of the conflict, who still believe that the two-state solution is possible. In my much shorter career, I spent a lot of time arguing with people that it is possible, it is still possible, and I know how hard it is to try to convince others it is. But since last time I saw Ambassador Kurtzer, I had moved to the comfortable position where I can sit back and say, no, nothing's going to happen, and the conflict's not going to be resolved. And it's a much more comfortable position, I have to say, especially if you're sitting in the United States. So I will do this this evening. I will sit in my comfortable position and let Ambassador Kurtzer try to explain how and why two-state solution is still possible. And we'll come back with questions. Please.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Ezzedine for the invitation. I had this vision after the snow started falling of an experience that a friend of mine had at a university, neither Dartmouth nor Princeton, in which he got so frustrated that the students were not doing the reading that he actually did not allow them into the class one day and gave the lecture to an empty classroom. And I kind of envisaged that was going to happen today, so I admire all of you for braving the storm, which will make it worse when we get back outside in an hour and a half, but we'll see what happens. I also would note that there was an exaggeration in the introduction, several exaggerations, but the one that I would point to, in which Ezzedine said that I'm one of the people who believes in the two-state solution. I think I may be the only one, and that may be an exaggeration. But you'll see tonight why I think it's still at least possible after I go through all of the reasons why we are facing extraordinary challenges to try to get there. As I explained to class this morning here, in looking at trying to set up a peace process or resume negotiations, one doesn't only look at the substantive issues that divide the parties or the process by which to negotiate, whether through a conference, bilaterally, multilaterally, but rather there's a context in which negotiations take place. And it's important, at least analytically, to understand the international, regional, and local dynamics at play, and certainly the politics at play within the parties that are going to negotiate. So I want to start with a little bit of that context, focusing initially on the regional situation. Because as one looks at this region and all of the troubles that it is going through currently and that have been endemic to the Middle East for many years, the first question that a policymaker is going to ask is, why would I want to get involved in this? What's the payoff? What's the possibility of success? And it's a region which is facing very significant problems, not limited to the persistence of the Arab-Israeli conflict. I don't expect you to read all of these issues, but what they represent is a sense through a report done by the United Nations, the Arab Human Development Report, of the complex of issues that Middle Eastern societies face. You're talking about issues of governance in which countries don't have governments that are providing not only the services that are required to sustain food security and education and all the other things that we come to expect, but also the persistence of societies in which there is corruption within the economic system, crony capitalism, in which there is population growth that has been unable to be curbed, and that has contributed to a situation in which societies in this region are unable to provide the basic needs, including education, health, and food. One of the places that serves as an example is Cairo. When I first served in Cairo between 1979 and 1982 as a relatively junior political officer, population of the country was about 36 million. And at that time, we invited an American demographic population expert to visit and to advise then President Sadat on how efforts might be made to limit in some way population growth so that it wouldn't get out of hand. 36 million in 1979, 1980, virtually nothing was done, and the population in Egypt is now approaching somewhere between 95 and 100 million people, and there is no food security, and there is no way in which that society can provide jobs for graduates from the universities. There's no room in the universities. Cairo University, once one of the great universities in the world, should accommodate, about 25,000, 30,000 students, well over 120,000 students, which means that there are students who don't see the inside not only of a classroom, but also of a laboratory. And think how scary that is when scientists are emerging who have studied things out of a book, but haven't experienced the hands-on activities that go on inside a laboratory. So it's a region which is facing these enormous problems, has not been able to deal effectively with them. This slide, the next slide, just gives you a little sense of it. Youth unemployment by region. By 2020, the region will need 60 million new jobs. It can't produce 60 million new jobs, even with an enormous amount of both external and internal investment. And frankly, the environment is such that it scares away investors, not only from the outside, but think about the sovereign wealth funds that are generated in the Middle East, but are then transferred out of the Middle East because those who own the sovereign wealth funds, the oil-producing, gas-producing countries, don't feel that the region is a secure place to invest their own profits. This suggests what the cost of conflict is in this region. 5% of the world's population, but 17.6% of the world's conflicts, 45% of global terrorist attacks, and on and on and on. And this is a symptom and a result of the serious and persistent problems that the region faces. in the context of what this region faces, there's also been a period of about 25 years in which the region faced a number of what I would call systemic shocks. In other words, unexpected developments that exacerbated the already problematic environment of the Middle East. The first of those, counterintuitively as a shock, was the end of the Cold War. One would think the end of the Cold War is totally a positive development, and it was. But for a Middle East that had largely thrived on the competition between the two superpowers, where the powers in the Middle East could play off the United States and the Soviet Union against each other for favors, for assistance, and for support, the end of the Cold War, in a sense, denied the Middle Eastern states the possibility of playing this game. And with a unipolar world that emerged after 1991, this became a shock to the system. One example, you remember in 1990-91, the United States and an international coalition fought against Iraq to push Iraq out of Kuwait. Iraq had invaded Kuwait in August of 1990. Who joined that coalition? Not only Western countries, but Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and other Arab countries, which presented the ahistorical phenomenon of Arab countries joining a Western coalition to fight against an Arab country. It tells you the disorientation that was caused within the region as a result of what I call a systemic shock of the end of the Cold War. Second, not in time necessarily, was the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003. Whereas in 1990-91, the U.S. military activity against Iraq not only found support within an international coalition, but it also gained support from the UN Security Council. In fact, the UN Security Council authorized the use of force to reverse Iraq's aggression against Kuwait. That didn't exist in 2003. The United States did have a few coalition partners, including the United Kingdom, tried to make the argument that some Security Council resolutions provided the necessary go-ahead for the U.S. to invade Iraq. But we know, and most of us knew at the time, that this was largely an effort undertaken unilaterally by the United States. And that invasion and the aftermath of the invasion, which in the words of Colin Powell at the time, you remember, if you break it, you own it, it broke Iraq. It is still a broken country, and the regional implications have been felt ever since, including an environment in which first Al-Qaeda prospered in that area, and then ISIS prospered in the area, the so-called ungoverned space between Iraq and Syria. The third systemic shock, or incredibly important shock, was the positive activities of the people during the Arab revolutions of 2011. And for the Middle East, this was a new phenomenon. We always knew that the militaries in the region were important. We knew that Islamic movements were important. We knew that the so-called deep state, or the bureaucracies, the persistent elements of government were important. But in very few places in the region did the people actually participate in a meaningful way in the politics of their countries. And of course, we now all remember those scenes in Tahrir Square and elsewhere where people brought down autocrats and authoritarian rulers. The problem, of course, is that the people had no preparation for what they had accomplished. There was no leadership, no program, no direction. And so it was like, we were just talking about it, like a gas in the air that explodes and then it dissipates. And so you had this idea of people power sending a shockwave through the region, but look at the impact of that people power. Yes, it brought down a dictator in Tunisia, it brought down a dictator in Egypt, but you have a new dictator in Egypt, you have a crisis in Tunisia, and you have failed states in Libya, Yemen, and of course in Syria. And you have challenges elsewhere. There was an uprising in Bahrain. It was put down through Saudi intervention. It tells you that the people power had some positive impact in bringing to the fore the issues and problems that the Middle East had to confront, but didn't go anywhere. It didn't lead to a positive outcome. And of course, the fourth impact was the rise of movements like ISIS, which took advantage of what we are now easily calling ungoverned space, and what we know to be the absence or the breakdown of borders. The so-called agreements that were reached during World War I, Sykes-Picot, and following World War I, which largely established artificial but seemingly permanent borders in the region, proved to be artificial and not so permanent. And so groups like ISIS could not only carry out terror activities and basically challenge stability in the area, but they also tried to establish their own kind of government, a caliphate that would occupy space and presumably expand. So in the problems that existed in the region were now exacerbated by these four shocks to the system. And I'll get to later the fifth shock, which is the absence of peace between Palestinians and Israelis. It's a long-term, chronic, and protracted problem, not necessarily a kind of shock to the system, but one which has contributed to the region's problems. Not all seemed lost, however. In 2002, the United Nations asked a number of Arab intellectuals and policy figures to try to figure out for themselves what was wrong with the region. In other words, the UN said, we're not going to call in Western experts and academics, but we're going to ask the Arabs themselves, try to figure out what it is that needs to be done, what it is that's wrong that needs to be fixed. And in the first of what became a series of reports called the Arab Human Development Reports, I referred to it earlier, these Arab intellectuals published through the United Nations a set of ideas that essentially diagnosed problems in their own society. And the first diagnosis focused on three deficits, which they said if those deficits could be addressed, you would start to address the larger problems in the region. Number one was the deficit of freedom, the freedom to associate, to form political parties, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, all the freedoms that we take for granted here in the United States and many other places in the world. And the Arabs said about themselves, we don't enjoy these freedoms. And a prerequisite for us to develop politically and economically and socially is to be able to fulfill or fill that deficit and enjoy those freedoms. The second deficit was what they called a deficit of knowledge. Now, they were not referring to Arabs being smarter or less smart. They're referring to the very significant weaknesses of Arab educational systems. I mentioned earlier about the problem of overcrowded Cairo University. What really gets noted in these reports is the fact that most Arab educational systems are still based on rote memorization. You walk into a class, you have a certain amount of things you have to memorize, and that's your assignment, and doesn't create the kind of creative self-actualization that we try to imbue in students here in the United States and many other places in the world. Give you one example from my own experience. In 1998, when I arrived in Cairo, at that time, the United States had provided Egypt with about $750 million of assistance for Egyptian educational programs. And we focused on two things. Number one was classroom size, and that meant that we were in the building trade. We were trying to build more classrooms so that instead of having 40 or 50 kids in a class, particularly at the elementary level, you might cut that in half and improve instruction that way. And second, we were focused on girls' education. We use that as the two metrics of success. I asked our director of the Agency for International Development in Cairo right after I arrived to show me how our aid program was doing by giving me the metrics by which we were measuring each of our activities and then to see how we were doing. And some of them we were doing quite well. We were helping Egypt build its capabilities in producing energy, electricity. water and wastewater and so forth, we were doing exceedingly poorly in education. There was no progress registered in either of the two areas that we were focused on. So I went to the Minister of Education and I said to him, I'm not going to give you any more money. Now, what he didn't know is that I had not talked to Washington before saying that. And I don't know if I could ever have cut off the pipeline. But he got nervous enough that he developed a reform program. I told him I didn't want to do that. It's not my job to reform Egyptian education. It was my job to provide some of the means for him to reform Egyptian education. And so at least maybe something was done over the following years to improve some of these activities. The third deficit, so you have a deficit of freedom, a deficit of knowledge or education. Third deficit was women's empowerment. And the Arab intellectuals and public policy figures said, look what we're doing. Essentially, half of our societies are not having access to the jobs and the professions that we need in order to progress. It's not uniform across the region. In some areas of the region, Egypt being one of them, women have a certain amount more access to jobs and professions. In other areas, we celebrate today the fact that some women are allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia, as though that's some major breakthrough where women still can't do basic jobs and contribute to the economy. That was in 2002. We're now in 2018. There have been at least 5 subsequent Arab Human Development Reports, and none of them shows much progress in any of the deficit areas. So I've mentioned all of this, and we could spend a lot of time, but I mention this because of the context in which that fifth shock to the system that I do want to talk about at some more length, the absence of peace between Israelis and Palestinians, is taking place. And so the political leaders who are involved in that peace process look at this region and say to themselves, particularly those in Israel, are we crazy to try to make peace here in Palestine, Israel, when this region is essentially in terrible shape? For the Israelis, peace will involve, especially if they move toward a two-state solution, peace will involve giving up territory. It's the old adage of territory for peace. Israel would withdraw from the territories that it occupied in the June War of 1967, in return for which there would be a peace treaty that would assure security for both sides. Both sides would have political rights guaranteed and so forth. And the Israelis say to themselves, you're asking me to give up territory today when we have a problem in Lebanon with Hezbollah, we have a problem in Syria, which is possibly going to spill over into our territory. Jordan is a reliable ally, but Jordan has been overridden not only with Palestinian refugees over the years, but Iraqi refugees and now Syrian refugees. And you have an insurgency even in Egypt, in the Sinai Peninsula. So why are you asking me in this regional context to take the risks for peace? And that's what we're going to discuss over the next few minutes. You have a president who surprised all of us, not only by winning an election, but also by announcing on the day after the election, in November of 2016, that he was going to make the peace process into a high priority and that he could achieve the ultimate deal, that only he could achieve the ultimate deal. And so the president raised expectations that either through his own diplomatic prowess, through his own deal-making capabilities, he was going to be able to do what none of his predecessors had been successful at doing. And if that's the case, one needed to understand, the president needed to understand going into this, that there was a difference between what he had been used to doing, which was real estate, and the Middle East peace process. This is not a real estate deal. Yes, it involves territory, but no, it's not simply over territory. Secondly, the president would need to understand that there's a difference between thinking about making peace by pushing for an outside in other words, using the Arab world as a catalyst for peacemaking, or using bottom-up by simply improving the situation on the ground as a catalyst for peacemaking, and ignoring or actually paying attention to what's called top-down. In other words, the issues that divide Israelis and Palestinians. territory security, refugees, Jerusalem, you name it, okay? So this is very complex. It's neither a real estate deal nor a way in which you can avoid dealing with the most concrete, substantive issues that divide the parties. CBMs is a term of art, confidence-building measures. There's always been an assumption in peace processes that you can get two parties to do things that instill confidence in each other. And if you can do that, that will help create an atmosphere, an environment that makes peacemaking easier. We have learned in the Middle East peace process that confidence-building measures simply don't work in the absence of an ongoing process. In other words, you can't use confidence-building measures to stimulate a process, but you want to think about them once you have a process going, because at that point, that can help the parties deal with some of the problems that they have. I gave an example this morning to the class in which in October of 1991, James Baker was in Damascus talking to the Syrian foreign minister about the upcoming Madrid peace conference. Syria had just agreed after a very long haul. Baker had done, I think, 8 shuttle missions to the region, and Syria had finally agreed to go to what was to be the Madrid conference. So Baker was covering a lot of ground with Farouk Ashara, the foreign minister, and one of those was what we call public diplomacy. How was Shara going to respond to basic questions that would be asked of him before he went to Madrid? So we covered things like, how do you deal with the question of the Golan Heights? How do you deal with security? And Baker said to Shara, how are you going to answer the question about, will you shake hands with the Israeli representative at the peace conference? At which point Shara says, never. I will never shake hands with the Israeli aggressor. They have blood on their hands. They've killed my people and so forth. So Baker said, that may not be the best answer. After all, we are going to a peace conference. And they talked for a few minutes about alternative ways that Shara could answer the question without compromising his own very emotional views. And for example, one way would be to ignore the question and say, look, symbols and acts such as handshaking are not important. We're going to Madrid to make peace. That's the important thing. So Shara says, okay, I understand. A couple days later, Baker has left town. Shara goes to a press conference. Second question, are you going to shake hands with the Israeli representative? And you know what Shara said. Never. So, okay? So confidence-building measures before you have a process do not work. And Trump needs to understand that, especially if he's asking the parties to do things that are hard for them to do politically in the absence of some movement that can persuade their publics that there's a reason to make movement. Status quos are not static. There's a tendency on the part of everybody to believe that we can manage the conflict, we can let it go for a while. After all, the killing is basically stopped. You still have some of it every day, but it's certainly not an active war. But status quos are not static. They usually go backwards unless you can promote forward movement. We could talk about the other things, but I do want to move on. The point is that this administration needed to do a lot of homework, especially because of the kind of people that Trump appointed to run this process. He appointed his son-in-law. Without saying anything about the son-in-law's capabilities, son-in-law had no background in any of this, had to do a lot of studying. He appointed his lawyer from the Trump organization, Jason Greenblatt. He appointed as ambassador to Israel his bankruptcy lawyer. And they have kept the process mostly internalized among the three of them. They're asking questions of people. They're not suggesting what direction they're heading. They're not providing any kind of feedback. And we now know from a tape that was leaked from a conversation that Kushner had with White House interns, where he says to the interns, I do not need to read books about the Middle East peace process. I just have to make the deal. Not a great way to start in a process that's as complicated as this one is. One of the things they need to understand, again, I'm not going to go through the long list, is the importance of narratives. It's an area, when I teach the Middle East conflict, when the Arab-Israeli conflict, I start with this, and we spend a great deal of time on it, because in a way, the issue of narratives underpins each side's emotional attachment to its position in the actual conflict itself. And the exercise I do in my classroom is basically to say to a group of students who have never really studied the Arab-Israeli conflict, tell me what you know from newspapers and from discussions at home or elsewhere, what you think is important to the two sides. And by the end of the class, we have a list on one side of things that they think are important to Israel, and we have a list on the other side of things that are important to the Palestinians. And the list is the same. Both sides have a kind of mirror imaging view of what it is that's important to them, which tells you how hard it is to deal with it. Because if both sides have the same demands and the same historical problems and the same requirements, it really does take a bit of doing to try to overcome those differences. Israel, in a sense, is the occupying power. Faces a very serious dilemma we talked about a little bit in class today. And this is the classic Venn diagram, where Israelis will tell you they want to be a democracy, which Israel has been a very vibrant democracy since its inception. They want to be a Jewish state, in other words, a majority Jewish state where Jews can feel that they are actualizing self-determination and they have responsibility for their own affairs. And many will tell you at the bottom that they want to maintain the post-1967 boundaries, the reason being that they have this attachment to the land, all of Eretz Yisrael, all of the land of Israel. What this very minimal diagram tells you is you can't have it all. Because if you want to maintain the post-1967 boundaries and be a democracy, you end up with a one-state solution. And if you end up with a one-state solution, Israel faces the problem of what do you do with the people? Because you can get the territories, but do you then give the people free democratic rights, free voting rights, and that gets you into your demographic issue. Between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, probably about 10 million people, maybe 52, 53% are Jewish, and that calls into question the idea that you're going to have a long-term Jewish majority state. So let's say you say, okay, I want to be a Jewish state and maintain the post-1967 lines. Well, the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, said, if that's the case, where you want to maintain the Jewish state and you want to maintain the territory, which means you're not going to give rights to Palestinians, you're going to be an apartheid state, because you're going to deny the rights of voting and full citizenship to a large percentage of your population. And that's not been acceptable to the international community. Which means that if you want to be a Jewish state and you want to remain a democracy, it leads you back to the two-state solution. And if you go to the middle, a democratic occupation is simply not possible. So the dilemma for Israel can never be simplified in this way, except in a way, this is what they face. The dilemma for Palestinians is, in a sense, more complicated. They are the weaker party, they're under occupation, they think they have options of either participating in a peace process or maintaining a status quo until the situation gets better, maybe trying elections and unification, maybe trying resistance again. None of these options has proved possible or viable in the past. And therefore, in a way, as a party that has not assumed agency, has not assumed real responsibility to move this peace process forward, the Palestinian dilemma is at least as serious as the Israeli dilemma, if not worse. The United States has tried to advance the process of peacemaking for quite a long time. The most recent example of which was what John Kerry, the Secretary of State, tried to do in 2013-14. And as this suggests, Kerry actually had a fairly sophisticated approach, in my view, approaching the sophistication of what Baker did in the pre-Madrid days. Between Baker and Kerry, this is not a plug for my books, but if you want to know why I said what I just said, buy my books. The point is, between Baker and Kerry, the U.S. approach to the peace process was very terribly faulted. Kerry did learn from past problems. And so before he even started to talk about a peace process, he tried to do some things that would condition the parties to be ready to negotiate. He brought Arab foreign ministers together to try to reaffirm and reconfirm the Arab Peace Initiative, which had been adopted in 2002, repeated in 2007, which basically held out the prospect of peace, normalization, and security for Israel once a Palestinian state was created and Israel withdrew from the territories that it occupied. Kerry asked General Allen, John Allen, who had been the head of our forces in the Middle East and retired, to do a very deep security study that would address the Israeli concern about withdrawing from territory that, at least in military terms, is considered to be valuable. It gives Israel a little bit of strategic depth. It gives Israel control over some of the high ground. It gives Israel control over the Jordan River crossing. And what Allen did over a period of time, working with the Israeli Defense Forces, although not at the end with the concurrence of the Israeli political system, what Allen showed is that through a very detailed, multi-layered, multi-tiered approach, there were ways to deal with Israel's security concerns in the context of withdrawal for peace. If you want an indication of what Allen did, it's not the full report. The Center for New American Security, CNAS in Washington, published part of Allen's study about a year and a half ago. And you'll see, even in the unclassified published version, how detailed and complex the security arrangements would be that would then offer Israel some kind of a safety net were it to withdraw from the territory, the valuable territory that it was holding. Kerry also gave support to economic initiatives, a private sector initiative which had been undertaken by Israeli and Palestinian business people, and an initiative started at Davos, the World Economic Forum, that promised a $4 billion investment in a Palestinian state once it would be established. In other words, what Kerry tried to do was to create an environment in which the two parties would start to pay attention. He then did something interesting. Rather than try to get the two sides to simply do CBMs, he pre-negotiated CBMs, confidence-building measures. And he asked each side, what's the most important thing that you would want to see from the other side? And vice versa. And then if he could get that, he would then try to hold each one accountable for what they had committed to do. The Palestinians said the most important thing for them in this context was prisoner release. It's always been an important issue for Palestinians, and they pointed to 104 prisoners that had been in Israeli jails for several decades for capital offenses, basically from the pre-Madrid or pre-Oslo period. And they said, we want the release of those prisoners. That's the most important thing for us. The Israelis said the most important thing for us at this time is that the PLO stop trying to upgrade its status in the United Nations system and not to pursue what's called lawfare, going to the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court to punish Israel. And both sides committed to do this. So Kerry thought. The problem was that there were misunderstandings. And it tells you that even if you try to pre-negotiate CBMs, you also can run into problems. Kerry thought he had Israeli agreement to release 104 prisoners, but the Israelis say that they told Kerry that they would release about 80 prisoners who were Palestinians, but would not release 24 prisoners who were Israeli citizens. In other words, they were Israeli Arabs, Palestinian Israeli citizens, and they said, we'll decide if we want to release them, but we're not going to release them as a response to a Palestinian Authority demand. Palestinians have no right to demand from us to release our own citizens from jail. They do have a right to demand to release Palestinians, and the Israelis say they never promised to release the last 24 prisoners. The Palestinians say that they told Kerry that there was a time limit on this whole process, and that if they didn't get the release of the prisoners within a certain period of time, everything would fall apart. And it did. In the spring of 2014, when the Israelis made clear they were not going to release the last 24, the Palestinians applied for recognition in 14 United Nations agencies, and the process broke down. Kerry then tried a regional approach, the outside in. He brought Prime Minister Netanyahu and President of Egypt, King of Jordan, to a summit meeting in Aqaba. These are some of the issues they discussed. That broke down as well. And it leads then to the question of what do you do now? And with this, I'm going to conclude. We talked a little bit in the morning and at lunch over whether or not there are alternatives to the two-state solution. And there are alternatives to the two-state solution. The problem is that none of them works. You can go down this list. Selective annexation, unilateral disengagement, violent resistance, nonviolent resistance, coordinated unilateralism, confederations, and all the rest. There's a whole long list, and it grows all the time. Just this week, there are two articles, one by Bernard Avishai, who teaches here at least part of the year on the idea of confederation, another by some former Israeli generals who have an idea about creating a Palestinian state in the Sinai Peninsula. Every week, there's a new idea for dealing with the Arab-Israeli, Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and none of them works. Does a one-state reality work? I wrote an article just a few weeks ago that, in fact, what the status quo is really leading us to is not a status quo, but to this one-state reality, where activities undertaken by both sides, either proactively or reactively, are creating the conditions that are going to make it very, very difficult, if not nearly impossible, to create a two-state solution. We don't know what Trump's ultimate deal is going to be. He complicated his own diplomacy recently by basically siding with Israel on the question of the capital of Israel in Jerusalem without reference to Palestinian demands. He exacerbated that by cutting off United States funds to the UN agency that provides assistance to Palestinian refugees without offering an alternative way of dealing with the humanitarian crisis that has ensued. Palestinians in response have reacted angrily. You probably have seen the speech by President Mahmoud Abbas that was awful in terms of not only anger, but the vituperation and the charges that he made about Israel's very nature and its very being, and has basically said that the United States is no longer a legitimate third-party mediator. And so a president who started out saying that only he could make the ultimate deal has now contributed to taking the United States out of the deal-making process. And so we're left with, in the Middle East, you have the 10 Commandments. I sometimes, when I've talked about this, some of you may have seen the Mel Brooks film, History of the World, Part 1, where Moses goes up to Mount Sinai and God says, I'm going to give you the laws for the people of Israel. And he walks out with 3 tablets. And he says, people of Israel, God has given you 15. And he drops one of the tablets and says, 10 commandments. We never know what the other 5 are. These are 10 ideas for advancing the prospects of peace in the Middle East. And several of them are doable, but they will require earnestness and backbone on the part of a president who says he wants to make a deal. The first is U.S. parameters. What are parameters? Very often when the parties, the Palestinian Israelis, have started to negotiate, they've walked into the room without any terms of reference. Now, they both know what the issues are, but they then both start the negotiations from 180 degrees apart. The reality is they've made some progress over the years in narrowing some of the differences, and what the U.S. can do is to concretize that progress and say, instead of starting negotiations from here, you're going to start negotiations from here. In other words, the U.S. doesn't dictate the outcome, but dictates what's not really acceptable as a starting position. We did it once before. President Bill Clinton did it in 2000, put out some parameters, pulled it off the table. But in fact, those parameters of 2000 have been used by the two sides to negotiate. And having used them to negotiate, they've actually made some progress in narrowing the gap between them, which means that there's a reason now for the president to think about putting forth a narrower set of parameters to be used as terms of reference for negotiations. I would think that after you do that, you want to take those parameters to the Security Council and ensconce them as a resolution that succeeds Resolution 242, which is the basis for the peace process, but it was agreed November 22nd, 1967. In other words, 50 years ago, a little more than 50 years ago, we're using as a basis today a resolution that is now terribly outdated. So one possibility is to take these parameters and make them into a new basis for negotiations. You can expand the international quartet, that's the US, the European Union, United Nations, and Russia, meaning that you have international support. You have to hold the parties accountable for what they do, correct economic imbalances. There's a number of things, 10 in this case, that the United States can do, all of which are politically difficult, but all of which, or even any of which, would contribute mightily to advancing the prospect for peace. So I may be one of the few people left that believes that the two-state solution is both viable and achievable, but it's only viable and only achievable under several conditions, the most important of which is leadership. And if we have a president who says he wants to do this, he's going to have to understand that it's going to take a little bit more than a bully pulpit to make this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we'll take questions.
Or
and
comments.
I'll ask you please to identify yourself and then ask your question. Could be also a comment and then a question mark at the end. I interrupted you this morning, so I'm happy to give you, yes, Pierre?
Mr. Ambassador, it's lovely to see somebody who still dreams of a two-state solution. I dreamt of it all my life myself, but I've grown to be... I've grown to be very disillusioned by the possibility of it, because when you look at the map and the settlement map, and the intent of the early settlers and Ariel Sharon, who wanted to have facts on the ground. He wanted to establish facts on the ground, and by that he meant immovable facts on the ground. To me, it seems at least the settlement enterprise has won, and it's too late, unless you're able to convince me or people like me as to how the Israelis would be able to remove the settlers from the West Bank, or whether they would accept to live under Palestinian sovereignty, as Arafat had in the past offered them to be always welcoming the Jewish community within Palestine. How do you see that bit happening?
There are a couple ways to address this question, and in fact, the two sides have talked about this very issue, most recently in the context of Kerry's diplomacy, but more intensively in 2008, when Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas were negotiating. And several ideas have emerged to deal with it. Number one is the idea of what they call swaps, in which Israel would retain the larger settlement blocks where probably 70 to 75% of the settlers are living, and would quote-unquote compensate Palestinians by offering equal quality and equal quantity of land inside Israel proper. And there are some maps that show what this might look like, a little bit near Gaza, a little bit near the southern West Bank, a little bit north of Jenin in the northern West Bank. They're all very small pieces of land because the amount of territory that's actually occupied by settlers in the blocks is relatively small, probably no more than 5% of the West Bank. So you would be taking 5% of the West Bank to allow the 75% of the settlers to remain in place, and you would be offering 5% of Israel proper for Palestinians to take control in the context of a state. And that's been the most significant advance on this question. The problem is that the longer we don't get to that solution, the more intense this problem becomes, because Israeli settlements continue. There's an effort by the settler community to create more blocks, which means they want to alienate more territory and make it more challenging. I mentioned at lunch that when I have taken my graduate students several times when we've been doing studies on this issue, and we've watched this phenomenon grow where two settlements that may be 10 or 15 kilometers apart in year one, 2 years later, are 8 kilometers apart because they've expanded in the direction of each other consciously in order to try to create a bloc that would make it impossible for Israel to give it up, which means that there is an urgency to creating a prospect of peace in order to stop this deterioration from continuing.
I have a question.
Wait, I convinced everybody.
I see that, so I'm trying to regain some territory on the impossibility.
Yeah, okay.
Now, I like very much the last 10 points, and I think 1 and 4 in particular are very difficult. One is to set the parameters. Now, I agree the parameters are key for any negotiation to succeed. The problem is, however, political. There is a reason why US presidents have refrained from offering those parameters, and that is the parameters would make the political arbitrations that the parties are politically divided around them. And the only time we have parameters were made by Clinton. We had an Israeli prime minister in the other room who's basically communicating those parameters through the president. So unless you have an Israeli prime minister who's willing, it seems unlikely that an American president would have the political strength and courage and whatever that would take in order to offer parameters that do not have Israel's support. So how do you break this?
Look, you're exactly right. If we look at the behaviors of the last 3 presidents, of George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and now, and the current president, all of whom have been quite wary of doing this, have not wanted to face the political consequences of stepping forward. Bill Clinton did try it at the end of his administration, did not suffer much heat for it because he was already on his way out. And so it's not a simple question. You need a president who is determined to take that political heat because of the importance to the United States, to his own agenda, especially if he's declared that this is a priority for his agenda, for that agenda to succeed. We have 3 historical instances of presidents who have bucked the traditional political safety net and have succeeded. There are 3 cases in which U.S. intervention has succeeded. One was in 1975 when Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger's Secretary of State, called for a reassessment of U.S.-Israeli relations in the face of an Israeli rejection of a U.S. proposal to effect a Sinai withdrawal, and it ended up working. Now, the U.S. paid a price for that by offering Israel a number of off-the-table concessions, but the fact is that the pressure certainly worked. Second, you had the case of Jimmy Carter's intervention in the Israeli-Egyptian negotiations. Carter and Begin never got along after that because of Carter's opposition to settlements, but you ended up with a peace treaty, mostly because the Israelis and Egyptians wanted it to happen, but it would not have happened as easily had Carter not intervened. And third is the example that we talked about in class this morning of George H.W. Bush and James Baker bringing Arabs and Israelis together at the Madrid Peace Conference, including a crisis with Israel over loan guarantees for Soviet Jewish immigrants. And that was a very interesting case because the United States had been part of the solution that we had been seeking for many years of getting the Soviet Union to open its doors to emigration. And on the one hand, you would say the U.S. should have wanted to celebrate this by offering assistance to Israel to absorb them. But the condition was that Israel would absorb them anywhere except the occupied territories. And when then Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir said he wouldn't agree to that condition, President Bush said he wouldn't give the money. We had a crisis. Shamir tried to circumvent Bush by going to Congress. Bush pushed back, and Congress supported the president. So you've had 3 cases where presidents, administrations have exerted the kind of backbone and had the kind of determination to succeed. And in all 3 cases, there was a positive outcome. My only argument here is do we have leaders with backbone? And are we ready to do the right thing, to absorb some of the pain of political protest, to look out the window of the White House and say, okay, there may be 100,000 people in Lafayette Park, but I'm doing the right thing and I'm going to continue to do it. And until we get that kind of a president, I don't think any of this can succeed.
Am I on? Appreciate your talk, Ambassador Kurtzer. I was wondering if you might speak to 2 points related to the current Palestinian negotiating position. So the first would have to do with what I perceive to probably be, but don't know for sure, a loss of foreign sponsorship, specifically in the Syrian state, which it's now of course finds itself somewhat beleaguered and embattled in its ongoing fight against rebels in its territory. And so to what extent has that in any way, hindered or perhaps potentially...
I lost the thread of the question. To what extent has what hindered?
Has the loss of foreign sponsorship, or like partial loss, potentially changed the Palestinian negotiating position in a favorable or unfavorable way? And the second is sort of around whether there's anything kind of meaningful to be said around any kind of fissure or fracturing between the sort of PA and Hamas.
Yeah, both good questions. Look, Palestinians for more than 50 years now have seen it as critical to their negotiating position as well as their national aspirations to build international support. When frustration grew in 2011 that the Obama administration was not doing what Palestinians wanted done, the Palestinians approached the United Nations and got an upgraded status of an observer state. They didn't get full membership because the U.S. threatened to veto that in the Security Council. And their efforts since 2011 have been to expand that international support. And they now have, I don't know the number, but it's over 100 states in the UN system that recognize Palestine as a state. So I'm not sure we can argue that they have a diminished international support. What they are experiencing is the fact that much of the international community has moved on. This is a protracted, chronic conflict, which frankly most people see as resolvable, and the fact that it's not resolved and there are more pressing problems in most other places of the world, people kind of roll their eyes and move on. And that's a problem that any of the peacemakers in this conflict are going to face. So I don't think it's a specific issue that they've lost support as much as it is that the peace process has become old business or old news for much of the world. The Hamas-Fatah split is very serious because it's both political and geographical. Hamas still controls Gaza. The PA, which is run by Fatah, largely controls the West Bank. And the idea of having a peace process with not only a subordinate entity, in other words, the people under occupation are negotiating with their occupier, but the people under occupation are now divided politically and geographically, makes this even more challenging. There have been efforts over the last decade or so to achieve reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas. So the United States has mostly opposed those efforts and exerted diplomatic efforts to undermine the possibility of reconciliation because we treat Hamas as a terrorist organization. Just this week, we included I guess he's the former prime minister or the former leader of Hamas in Gaza, Ismail Haniyeh, on the list of foreign terrorists, which now kind of ups the ante a little bit. There is an effort underway today to try to achieve reconciliation, but nobody gives it any prospect of success. And the proximate reason for its likely failure is that Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, has demanded that Hamas give up its arms to be reintegrated into Palestinian governance and society, and Hamas so far has said no. So it's a very serious problem internally within the Palestinian community.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you. How would you characterize the current bilateral relationship between Israel and Egypt? How do you see that relationship evolving, and what do you think will the dynamic of that relationship mean to a possible peace deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
Yeah. I'm sure the backdrop to your question is the David Kirkpatrick story in the New York Times this week, which based on what he said was extensive investigation, suggests that Israel has conducted bombing raids against insurgents in the Sinai Peninsula with the approval and active cooperation of Egypt. Now, if that's true, this is an quite unbelievable acceleration and intensification of a bilateral relationship, which for the past, what are we up to now, 40 years since 1979, has been characterized as a cold peace. From the moment the peace treaty was signed until this report, you could argue that the strength of the Israeli-Egyptian relationship was the fact that the treaty still existed and that they were both basically observing its security provisions. But there was no love lost between them. There was always a dispute. Egypt took the lead against, has taken the lead against Israel's reported nuclear program. Egypt always sides with a majority in the UN on anti-Israel resolutions. A very cold, almost nasty peace, even if it's been stable in terms of security. Since 2011, there has obviously been an evolution in the relationship where because of the growth of, or the instability in Sinai and so far the incapacity of Egyptian military to control the insurgency, Egypt, according to this article, has turned to Israel for the assistance that Egypt cannot, things that Egypt cannot do itself in Sinai. Now, that's going to be critically, if it's true, and I don't know whether it is or it isn't. Kirkpatrick is a first-rate journalist, and I'm not sure that he would publish it without some basis for publishing it. If it's true, it has enormous implications on the issue of regional security, because we've known for a long time that there have been back-channel discussions between Israel and a whole variety of Arab states, including the Saudis and the other Gulf states, who share a common dislike, even enmity status with Iran. And so they've used that common enemy as a way of closer ties, at least behind closed doors. But this would be a real ratcheting up of that kind of a relationship. The question then that you posed, what impact that might have on a peace process, remains to be seen. It would certainly cause, I think, problems within the Palestinian Authority to trust Arabs to provide support if those same Arabs are effectively in bed with Israel, fighting, even in this case, an enemy, insurgents, terrorists, whatever. One of the things that we've always looked for in the peace process was some degree of Arab support for the Palestinians to give them the confidence to take the risks for peace. But if, in fact, there's this kind of collaboration going on, it's going to be a problem for Palestinians to do. It may make it easier for Israel, but you have a government in Israel now which may use the burgeoning relationship with Egypt as an excuse not to do anything with the Palestinians. So it's a mixed blessing in many ways.
I like when you don't have questions because that gives me more. But Adam, please.
So thank you for the talk, and I share your optimism for the two-state solution.
All right.
But if the majority is right, and it's not going to be viable, you had a bunch of other options on your Venn diagram there. Where do you see the current status quo taking us?
You know, if I had my druthers in a situation where the two-state solution is not on the table, then the focus has to be on stopping the deterioration. I don't know what the positive step is, because I don't think there really is a viable alternative to partition, which effectively is the two-state solution. But at a minimum, rather than thinking that this status quo can remain stable while settlement construction is going on and while violence is continuing, I would focus a lot of attention on stopping the deterioration. You know, the old adage, when you're digging yourself into a hole, first thing you do is stop digging. And that would mean to put pressure on both sides to stop doing the bad things that they're doing that are undermining the possibility of ever getting to a two-state solution. Stop building those settlements that are creeping into blocks. Take greater action against so-called lone wolf terrorism, as we saw in the last month. A couple of Israelis in the West Bank being stabbed to death by individual Palestinians, maybe under instructions and maybe not. But greater efforts to stop the violence. Take some efforts to improve the way each side views each other in its textbooks. We've tended to look at the question of incitement only from the perspective of Palestinian textbooks and Palestinian public media, but you can find the same problems in Israeli textbooks and Israeli public media, and both can be encouraged to stop. One particular issue which is disturbing not only to Israelis, but many people here, is the subventions, the support that the Palestinian Authority provides to the family of those who have committed acts of terrorism. It's one thing to provide social security or a social network, but specifying that you're giving the money to those families can also be seen as a means of encouraging the lone wolf who perhaps has lost hope, perhaps has given up, but says, at least my family will be taken care of. And that's a problem which I think would need to be taken into account. So I'm not in favor of pursuing an alternative by having given up on the two-state solution, but I would argue if you can't do the two-state solution right now, stop doing things that will take you further away from the two-state solution.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and for coming to our class this morning. So you mentioned that there were many factors that were kind of aligning in the early 90s specifically that made you very optimistic about the peace process. By the time you were finishing up your service as ambassador, I don't know if you overlapped or were just ending, but by that time in 2005, the Gaza disengagement, Israel's disengagement from Gaza, seems like it could have really changed everything. How would you respond to the Israeli government, or more importantly, the Israeli public, about how their experience disengaging from Gaza would not be repeated if they left the West Bank? And obviously it might have to be different in terms of Israel not just disengaging unilaterally and having some more coordinated sort of effort.
Yeah, it's a great question. There have been 4 historical instances in which Israel has withdrawn from territory. 2 of them by agreement, the Egyptian and Jordanian peace treaties. Israel did give up some territory to Jordan that it had occupied south of the Dead Sea. And there are 2 times in which Israel has withdrawn from territory unilaterally and has encountered serious problems afterwards. One was the withdrawal from Lebanon in 2000 and the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. The Lebanon situation is quite different, so I won't talk about that unless you really want me to, because you drop a nickel in, I'll talk about anything. But the situation in Gaza, the main challenge that Israel did not address was twofold. Number one, preparing the ground for the settlers who were being evacuated. Many of them are still living in, maybe in some cases because they want to, but many of them are still living in housing that's not adequate, and that has given the society a sense that the government won't take care of people who are evacuated. So the idea of evacuating settlers and then having them live in relatively less standard or substandard conditions is one factor. And the other, I think, far more important factor was the lack of coordination. You can do a unilateral withdrawal in a coordinated fashion. And Prime Minister Sharon, despite all of our entreaties, didn't want to do that until the very end. There was a minimal amount of coordination in the summer of 2005, largely driven by pressure from his own military, who understood that if you walked out, locked the gate, and threw the key back over the fence, you were going to create a very serious problem. And in fact, that's what happened. There was no coordination that would lead to a sense of responsibility on the part of the Palestinian Authority to take over what the Israelis had left behind. It is not entirely Sharon's fault, however. We tried in the early stages of the disengagement process in 2004 before Yasser Arafat died in November of 2004, we tried from January until November to get Arafat to endorse the idea of unilateral disengagement, which we thought should be a no-brainer. Israel is giving up part of the territory that you want. They're not asking for anything in return. In a sense, they've lowered the bar, raised the sea, whatever it is. They've made it easier for you to deal with the West Bank. You don't have to deal with Gaza. Arafat would not do it, even though all of his advisors with whom we spoke thought that they should have embraced disengagement as the alternative of a negotiated solution. The reason it's important that these lessons be learned, and I'll bring you into a report that I gave to Secretary Rice when I left Israel, my position in Israel, 3 weeks after the disengagement. In other words, I was a year beyond the normal tour of duty because of disengagement, and then right afterwards, my tour of duty ended. And I came back to Washington and I told Secretary Rice that I was 100%, not 99, 100% sure that Sharon would do another disengagement in the West Bank if things worked out well in Gaza. And I was sure of that because I had seen his maps. He showed me his maps. He had ideas of what he could do in stages, and his way of thinking was, I'm not going to get to a negotiated situation with the Palestinians, but if things work out, we can get to the same place based on performance. We'll perform our part of it, which is withdrawing from territory in regular fashion, as long as they perform their part of it, which is governance and security. And I told Secretary Rice that it meant that we, the United States, had a role to play in trying to get the Palestinians to do the right thing and show that they could govern Gaza so that we could then go back to Sharon and say, okay, let's do stage 2, or stage 3 and stage 4. And the failure of the Palestinians in Gaza to effectively govern and to prevent the rockets and the violence, Sharon had the stroke before it was even raised as a possible issue, but that would have persuaded him that disengagement doesn't work. So those two issues, how the government of Israel treated the evacuees and how the Palestinians reacted to what they were getting on a silver platter. They were getting territory that normally you would say they'd have to negotiate over. They were getting it handed to them, and they weren't governing it properly, and they weren't securing it properly. Those are the two lessons that I think need to be learned from that.
I have two questions. Hopefully they're not going to be too complicated. The first, thank you. The first is, given that the two-state solution has been at least explicit policy practice since the 47 partition and probably further back, like during the British era, like the Peel Commission and all that, do you have any belief in the back of your head that maybe the two-state solution is just on its roots, on its fundaments, like not viable, in the sense that you have at least two popular opinions or public opinions that regard from their land as stretching from the river to the sea? I mean, you see that in both Israel proper and the West Bank and Palestine. But also just in rhetoric and in national identity, the land doesn't stop at the green line. The land continues, right? So when you're Israeli and you look at the Palestinians, you look at them as the wrongful inhabitants of this place. And if you're a Palestinian, you look at the Israelis as the wrongful conquestors of this place, right? So I guess my question is that, like, do you see that maybe the two-state solution isn't viable not because current conditions aren't amenable and leaders aren't good and maybe settlers are doing too much right now? Maybe it's just because at its roots it's never been feasible. That's one. I don't want to get more charged than that, but that's one. Two, can you just discuss the Arab Peace Initiative and maybe the U.S.'s role in fostering it? Because I've looked at the Arab Peace Initiative as the only thing that makes me optimistic about the two-state solution, because it's an Arab proposal, and I would love if the Arab world could be the one that stepped up to resolve this conflict and America's stepped back. But maybe you can discuss like the power dynamics and whether the Arab world actually could do that. So.
Yeah. Look, on the first question, you know, I have to tell you, I've thought about this. This is going to sound really sad, but every day for the last 40 years, literally every day. And I don't know, and I don't believe there is an alternative to the partition of this land in distinguishing between homeland and state, meaning that neither side has to give up the concept that all of the territory is part of its homeland, but both sides will have to accept that their individual state will not occupy all of the homeland, which means that after you have two states, provisions have to be made for each party to be able to fulfill some historical sense of itself in the other state by visiting historical sites, religious sites, places where relatives lived, in the Palestinian case where refugees came from, in the Israeli case where biblical figures, whatever it is that they need to do to manifest their attachment to homeland needs to be built into a two-state solution, because both sides do have a zero-sum view of this territorial conflict. If this is an impossible element to negotiate in a treaty, then you're right. Two-state solution can't work. I don't think it's impossible. It may be very challenging to do. You may have to come up with mechanisms that are unusual, but that's what we do in diplomacy. You know, we have, you know, examples abound about creative solutions that make no sense, but the two parties involved wanted to solve a problem, so they came up with an answer. I don't know how many of you have been to Glacier Waterton, Glacier National Park on our side and Waterton National Park on the Canadian side. Do you know that there is no boundary between the United States and Canada inside that park? The reason is we can't agree on where the boundary is. But instead of fighting over a boundary, as most countries do, we decided to make arrangements whereby if you enter from the United States side, you just enter. When you come out on the Canadian side, you go through passport control, and vice versa. While you're in the park, we have bilateral arrangements governing activities. In other words, what happens if I do something wrong, I will be returned to the United States. If a Canadian does something wrong, they get returned to Canada. It's a creative solution. And it's one that we actually tried to deal with in the Israeli-Syrian situation, because as some of you may know, there's a dispute over a very small quadrant in the northeastern part of the Sea of Galilee, which played a significant role in preventing an Israeli-Syrian agreement. It wasn't the only factor, but it played a role. And we introduced this idea and said, make it into an international park of some sort and have some international figure be the, you know, the park ranger and you know, just solve the problem. If it's not possible to get the two sides to work on this creatively, you're right, two-state solution is done. Even Jerusalem is amenable to it. I worked for a number of years with former Canadian diplomats on an initiative to deal with the most vexing problem in Jerusalem, which is the Old City. If you go on the internet to a site called Jerusalem Old City Initiative, you'll see hundreds of pages of research, analysis done by Israelis and Palestinians on how to deal with the Old City. And to give you just the headline of how to deal with it, you can't solve it. So instead of trying to solve it, fail, and then bring the whole house down, what you do is agree on everything else, and then you agree on a governance mechanism for this 1 square kilometer territory that's so valuable emotionally, historically, religiously to both sides. It's creative. I'm sorry?
Is this partition, or is this creative shared sovereignty
in
format?
In the Jerusalem Old City Initiative, it's creative shared. It's not shared sovereignty, because they would agree to defer sovereignty. It's a shared solution short of sovereignty in the context of a two-state solution. It's a hybrid of sorts. If they're not ready to make these kinds of special arrangements, special deals, then you're right, the two-state solution won't succeed.
Just to interject, like your approach sounds very familiar to, or very similar to the two states, one homeland thing that Professor Dejani spoke about last week, but is also gaining traction. Like, I think the one thing that you don't have in there is the inherent necessity for like a truth and reconciliation agreement, where it's not just like let's agree on the borders and the policy, but also like coming to a sense.
No, I agree you need that. I agree you need that. I don't know if I'd call it truth and reconciliation, right, but in the negotiations, especially in 2001, a little bit in 2008, the two sides actually started talking about this in the context of the narrative question on Palestinian refugees. Because the question has at least two dimensions. One is, can the refugees return to their homes in Israel? Israel says no. The other dimension is, do the refugees get some kind of historical recompense for the suffering that they've had over the years? The exile from their homes, the exile from their land, living in terrible conditions. And that question is going to be extremely vexing, because what the refugees want is an admission by Israel that Israel created the problem. And Israel says, we didn't create the problem. We may have contributed to the problem, but the problem was created as a result of war, Arab decisions, Israeli decisions. There's a lot of factors involved. So how you deal with that demand on the part of Palestinian refugees is going to be very important. And whether you call it truth and reconciliation or narrative elements within an agreement is going to be very critical. I haven't seen, I really should see Omar Dejani's proposal, if it's written up, and it may be that we agree on the two states, one homeland idea. Arab Peace Initiative, in brief, 2002, it's easy, it's a short document, you can read it online. The Arab states basically said that the conflict that they had with the state of Israel was no longer over Israel's existence. In other words, it's not a problem of 1948, but it's a problem of 1967, the occupation of Arab territories. And so the Arab Peace Initiative says if Israel withdraws from Arab territories, which they include the Golan Heights, but we'll leave that aside for the moment, the Arab states would offer Israel, in return for that, the peace, security, and recognition that Israel desires. On all of the issues, they were relatively careful, including on the refugee issue, where at the last minute they inserted the word agreed. The Arab position on refugees had always been implementation of Resolution 194, in which calls for the right of return of Palestinians to the homes they left behind, which is a non-starter for Israel. But the Arab Peace Initiative says there would be an agreed solution, which means that Israel would have some say in the implementation of that resolution. It occurred in February or March of 2002. It was the worst month of the Palestinian Intifada. On the average of every 2 days, there was a terror attack. 20 Israelis were being killed in cinemas, malls, restaurants. And so nobody paid attention in 2002, including the United States, unfortunately. The Arab states repeated it in 2007 in Riyadh. That took place in Beirut. 2007, they repeated it in Riyadh. And unfortunately, nobody paid attention in 2007 when the conditions were very different. And so the initiative has gone unresponded to for a long time. It finally appeared in a preambular section of the Annapolis Peace Conference in 2007. And it's kind of hanging around the edges now, with efforts having been made by many people to get an Israeli leader to respond to it in some way. It is, after all, an Arab position, so the Israelis don't have to accept the initiative, but they should respond to it with an Israeli initiative. And then you got an Arab initiative, an Israeli initiative, and they get together and they try to sort out differences. Hasn't happened yet. I think it's I'm sorry?
They can see kumbaya together.
That's hopefully what would happen, you know, roast the marshmallows and sign the peace treaty. It's a very important initiative, I think critically important, and I've been among those that have tried to get successive American administrations to at least take cognizance of it as an important part of the peace process.
One last question.
Thank you for coming.
The last question is always the zinger, so you better come up with a good one.
Speaking of creative diplomacy, can you talk about your experiences in being the ambassador at Egypt and Israel?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you repeat this?
Question was talk about my experience being an ambassador. So if you want to wait around, skip the storm, I'd be happy to talk about it. Look, it's an incredible experience to serve and to be able to do almost as much as you want to do. This is what I've told my successors. We all talk to each other, and they've asked me, well, what can you do? And I said, the horizons are unlimited. I saw both Egypt and Israel as an opportunity to do everything. So not just in Egypt, not just advancing, as we did very hard, the prospects for economic reform, and we made some progress, but also cultural issues. We mobilized an international coalition to try to stop the deterioration of the Luxor temple, which is being destroyed by the infiltration of water. You say, well, why would the American ambassador do that? And the answer was, because I could. And it was a problem that the Egyptian government was not taking care of. And so I convened a meeting with 5 or 6 other ambassadors, and we each got our country to do something. And one country built a drain around the temple, and we worked with farmers to change the crop rotation so they wouldn't be using heavy water required crops. We did some canaling and channeling of water. You can do anything you want, as big or as small. Some things require Washington's approval, but there's a term that the military usually uses that I adopted, which was unless otherwise instructed. In other words, I would do things that I thought were right and consistent with our overall policy. And then if Washington wanted to pull me back, they'd pull me back. But in most cases, they were happy that somebody was doing something, and they didn't have to think about it. Maybe the most interesting example in Israel, when the Intifada started in September of 2000, Israel stopped paying to the Palestinians the receipts of customs and duties that they were collecting at Ashdod port. Part of the Oslo agreement was, since the Palestinian Authority was importing almost everything that they needed, that the goods would come through Ashdod, where Israel would handle the security. They and the Palestinians would monitor the imported goods and collect the duties and customs. At the end of the month, they would sit and reconcile the books, and Israel would then pay that money to the Palestinian Authority. We're talking big money. It was about $120, $150 million a month of payments. The Intifada starts. Israel says, we're not going to pay that money anymore because these folks are now shooting at us and killing us, and they're buying weapons with the money. So they put the money in a bank. They put it in an escrow account. And I got to Israel about 9 months after the Intifada started. It was about $1 billion in the escrow account, and it continued to accrue those monthly revenues, driving the Palestinian economy into further dire straits. Make a long story short, because it is a long story, when we approached Israel and said, you've got to do something because this is a large amount of money they need, they said, well, we don't trust Arafat at that time to handle this money in a non-corrupt way. So if you can show us that there's accountability, financial accountability, we'll reconsider. June or May of 2002, Palestinians under pressure Arafat appointed Salam Fayyad as the Minister of Finance. Salam Fayyad was a longtime figure in the International Monetary Fund, head of an Arab bank, very, very well-respected international figure. 2 or 3 days after he arrived, I invited him and an Israeli general responsible for the territories to lunch in my home. I didn't ask Washington. And I basically fed them and said, figure this out, because you need the money, you have the money, you don't want these people to starve, you don't want to spend the money on guns, figure it out. And they started talking. Took about 2 months. Part of that discussion, they came back to me and said, we've reached a point where we're almost at an agreement, but we'd like the United States to fund one of the international accounting firms to sit in Fayyad's office to monitor his activities. I had to go to Washington now because I don't have that kind of money to pay for an international accounting firm. Washington approved. I went back to them and said, okay, you can do that. When they finally signed the agreement, they called me up and said, we don't need it because we trust each other. They had built up enough trust through the negotiations that Fayyad basically was able to run his own shop. The money started flowing from the escrow account, started flowing monthly accounts, and it solved the problem. Had I asked Washington for authority to do this, I would have gotten it, but it would have taken weeks. Interagency meetings, and there's always going to be somebody who opposes it, and somebody looks at the consequences of failure, and there's a lot of bureaucratic hoops that you go through when you take a complex policy issue and throw it into the Washington morass. In this case, it worked out fine, and Washington was okay with it. And if it failed, they had somebody to blame, me. But I give you an example because being able to do that and working on both the big policy issues and, as I mentioned, the cultural issues, the economic assistance issues, helping Israel cope with the question of Iraqi attacks that they anticipated during the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. You remember in the first Gulf War, Iraq had shot 46 Scuds at Israel. Luckily, not much damage was occurred, but the Israelis were nervous that 13 years later, capabilities would be greater and they'd be hurt more. And so we had to work through very challenging security issues. And I could go on and on and on. It's an extraordinary opportunity to do these things.
Well, on this positive note, we'll bring the conversation to closure. And I sincerely hope that you continue to push for the two-state solution and show skeptics like myself how it is still viable. I think this is a very sane voice in the debate, and I am sure I speak on behalf of many when I thank you for it. I also thank you for coming. It's been wonderful, and I think we've been very lucky to have Ambassador Kurtzer among us today. And please join me in thanking him for that. Thank you.